So there we go. And now I get to introduce our wonderful presenter, one of my favorite people, and my colleague, Gordon Jones. He's from our Southern Oregon Research and Extension Center, and he also serves Josephine County. He holds a BS in Environmental Studies and Sustainable Agriculture from Warren Wilson College and an MS and Ph.D. in Crop and Soil and Environmental Sciences from Virginia Tech. Gordon is passionate about sharing his knowledge of the integrated management of plant and soil systems. And he's a lot of fun and a great resource. We're really happy to have him. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and let Gordon start his presentation.
Let's see, let me just do this Zoom deal. I've got my millionth screen share. We'll see if I can do this correctly. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us, and thanks to everyone in the Land Stewards program for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be back with you and chatting about troublesome weeds. And yeah, so again, as Rachel said, please feel free to put chats in the chat box. If you've got like urgent and exciting things to say, you could probably take yourself off mute and just shout at me, and I'll stop and do that. We will cover a whole range of topics, from just the sort of general overview of integrated pest management, sort of a set of strategies and tactics to reduce the burden of weedy pests in our managed systems. We'll talk about, I think, 5 different troublesome weeds that I've picked because I know they're troublesome and also because they're interesting to talk about, and a little bit of theory on controlling plants and doing that safely. Just make sure all my technology is going here and with all my screens. All right, so this is a panel of troublesome weeds that I see and help folks with around Southern Oregon. I primarily serve Jackson and Josephine counties, and I trust there are folks from elsewhere in the state on the call tonight, but things from Medusa head and Himalayan Blackberry, yellow star-thistle, buttercup, juncus or rush, chicory, bindweed and foxtail and Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot are ones that just can think about as being troublesome weeds. And I trust that there are a number of other troublesome weeds that folks deal with, and I'm happy to either help you with that through Q&A or point you to some resources and tell you about how I go about thinking about weeds. I'm new to Oregon, I guess. Not super new. I've been here for about 4 years. But as you move from like one side of the country to the other, there are principles that stay the same and some of the same characters and actors you deal with, but there are lots of new ones. And even like every day, or every week at least, I hear about some weed that I've heard of that before, but I don't really know how to manage it. And I'll walk you through some of the questions that I ask myself as I think about managing weeds. And the first question the first set of questions that I ask myself in managing weeds is a little bit about the biology of those weeds themselves. Like to think about what is the life cycle of that weed. Is it an annual, meaning that it sets seed each year and can complete its life cycle from seed in the soil, plant grows, flowers, makes a mature seed and falls back to the soil, all in a 12-month period is what I would describe as an annual. And so it requires that, shedding of seed in order to propagate from one year to the next. Biennials do that same cycle from seed to seed over the course of 2 years, often needing the chilling or dark conditions of a winter in order to be spurred to set seed the following year. Or perennials, which can the same individual plant can live for many years in the ground without needing to propagate itself. It'll just hang on and do that. And so that's a helpful tip, and we'll talk about why that is. Then what is its reproductive strategy? How do you go from one plant to many? And so you can see here in many cases that's just done by seed, particularly in the annual and biennial plants, that they rely on flowering and shedding of seeds in order to reproduce. And so for me, as like a managed plant ecologist, I say, well, if it has to produce seed in order to reproduce, then I've got an opportunity as a manager to check that production of seed, to cut those flowers off, to do something to that plant before it sets ripe seed. And if I can do that, maybe over the course of several years, I can reduce that population because it's the seeds that allow it to regenerate. And so some plants like Himalayan Blackberry have multiple strategies. It's sort of a troublesome one. And I think you know that from looking at Bear Creek or driving around in Western Oregon, that there is Himalayan Blackberry all over the place. Can reproduce by seed, by stem tip sprouting, which we'll talk about, and also from its rhizomes or root sprouting can occur below ground. And the last question that I ask myself on this kind of thing is, how long does that seed last in the soil? When seed is an important reproductive strategy, I want to know, is that seed going to be like yellow star thistle, where most of it dies out in the first or second year and just a very little bit survives to the third or fourth? Or is it going to be something like buttercup, where once there are seeds in the soil, those seeds are going to be around for decades and they're going to continue to cause problems, even if I've eradicated all of the blackberry out of that system? And so as I think about a new weed, the one that I'm not super familiar with, these are questions that I would ask of: what is its life cycle? Is it annual, biennial, perennial? How does it reproduce? Is it by seeds or vegetative structures? And then how long do those seeds live in the soil? And all of those can help us to start to formulate a strategy about getting those plants under control. And so I want to sort of take a step to the theory of integrated pest management. And integrated pest management is a framework that helps us to think in a sort of scientific and practical way about managing pests that help us to do that effectively, cost effectively, without undue risk to ourselves as humans or to the environment. And we think about these 5 sort of steps of an integrated pest management program. And this can be applied both to the weeds, also to insects, to rodents, to fungi and diseases. We think about preventing pest problems, identifying those pests correctly, monitoring to understand when they are there, having action thresholds, and integrating tactics. Well, let's go through each of these. Preventing pest problems. In some cases, the weeds that we deal with are like global weeds. That buttercup is in every temperate, moist temperate region of the world, and it spreads around the world. It spreads somehow. And there's a question: how does it spread? And can I be involved in making sure that it doesn't spread to my property? And some sort of standard strategies to think about in doing that is by clean seed. Here I've said certified seed, that if you're planting just sort of like any of the range of crops that you would buy for your garden or your lawn, that you'd buy seed for, that the certification process of seed ensures that both that is like the genus and species and variety that you've intended to buy, but also make sure that it's free from noxious weeds. And you could potentially go pluck some seeds from your neighbor's field, and there's a chance that you would get all the perfect variety and species that you wanted, but there's a chance it would be contaminated with something else. And one of the reasons that's one of the reasons you buy certified seed, is just to make sure it is free from noxious weeds. That there are other things we bring onto the farm, like hay or mulch or fill soil, and those can all be sources of weed seeds. And so have to make some decision of like, is buying the cheapest hay or the cheapest fill soil really going to help me meet my long-term goal, particularly if it's going to bring in some unusual noxious weed that's going to cause me trouble. Can think about our landscape and garden plant choices. That some of the plants that you might grow in your garden or in your landscape have the capacity to like jump out of that place. That, let's think that I like walk around the Master Gardener gardens at SOREC, and they've got like a couple mint plants, and mint plants are particularly good about like climbing out of their bed and like underneath the wall of the raised bed and climbing over the next plant in the herb garden. And what are the consequences of those plant choices, and what can you do strategically if you know you've got a really sort of vigorous and competitive plant like mint that you want to grow in your garden, and you like keep it in one place. And then the final bit in terms of preventing pest problems, sometimes you have to like talk and engage with your neighbors. That I think about Canadian thistle or something like that, a plant that has seeds that move on the wind, that you may have done a good job over a number of years using a variety of tactics to control that that thistle on your property. But if your neighbor has done nothing and has a really great population of thistle, it may just take one season to recolonize your property. And so it may need to be that we have like a neighborhood weeding party, and we work in the whole sort of like corner of the valley to reduce the population of a weedy plant, being a better strategy than us all as individuals working on that alone. So we're preventing weed problems. Once we think we've got weeds or pests, we need to make sure that we can identify those properly. And this can be a challenge. We're not all as well trained a botanist as Rachel is. And there are like a range of strategies that you can use, that I would use on identifying weeds. You can look in a book. This one, Weeds of the West, is a common one for sort of like agricultural weeds. I like to look at my like 1,800 page 2-volume set of Weeds of California and other Western states. Require some botanical knowledge to do that very efficiently. When I'm being sort of lazy, I find myself having to look at every picture at every page of 1,800 pages of book, and that probably is not the most efficient use of time. There are apps that you can use. I've got one that, and maybe this is cheating, but I don't mind cheating if it helps me get to the right answer faster than looking at 1,800 pages of weed identification book. There's one that's called Picture This that I use, that take a photograph on your phone of that plant. It goes and like talks to the cloud and can do a pretty good job of identifying those plants. This is not like the end all be all, in the same way that you can open up your book to the right page and find a picture that looks sort of right. But you've got to do a little bit of work on understanding what really are the distinguishing characteristics. If this is my best guess, is this the right guess? And to that end, I really like the OregonFlora.org. It has the Oregon Flora Atlas, which contains lots of records that were put in by botanists of what have been found in field surveys. And so I tend to think that my level of like understanding the plant ecology within our region is one where it's like, chances are, if I'm finding a plant and it's turning up, to such an extent that I think it's weedy, I probably am not the first person to have found that. And so when that's the case, I can go to Oregon Flora and say, I've got a good guess of what this plant is. Has it ever been found in Jackson County? And if it has, then there's a better chance that I do have that plant. If it's never been found in the county, then I go talk to Rachel and we like puzzle over a little closer. Have we identified this correctly? But doing proper identification really is important to understanding those characteristics and the weak spots in the life cycle of pest plants. We need to monitor for pest plants as we sort of spend time on our property. We want to like wander around and just be sort of observant. That work with lots of farmers. Sometimes farmers like to do the like observation from the pickup truck at like 20 miles an hour going down the gravel road. And in some cases that is adequate to identify the weed in question and understand its population. In many cases, it's not. That generally by the time you see the like yellow flowers of the star-thistle or the yellow flowers of the buttercup, I say like, yes, great. If you had come and talked to me 6 weeks ago before those were really evident, we could have provided effective control, but it is now too late. We probably have to wait till next year or bundle around with something that's not going to be tremendously effective. And so being on the ground, being observant, understanding what some things are that you might be worried about or you saw last year, and really understanding what those life cycles are can be important. I would encourage folks also to check hotspots. Hotspots I think about like along the fence line with the neighbor where things might be blowing in, the place where you like park the tractor, you like were being friendly and went to your neighbor's house and mowed their pasture for them. You came home, you parked the tractor, it sat in that spot for a while, you got rained on once, a bunch of seeds have fallen off that tractor and the mower, and that seems like it could be a hot spot for bringing in new things, or driveway is another one in that realm. thinking about what the action threshold is. And this is a concept we use more frequently in sort of insect management, but I think it's relevant to weed management as well. And so dandelions, a common weed that folks struggle with in their lawns. Here's the image of like one single dandelion, and then the other image of lots and lots of dandelions. We might pick a different tactic. We may operate at like a different level of like aggressive management. I can probably tolerate like one or two dandelions or like a few weeds in my lawn, but we might say, I need to take some relatively aggressive action in order to get some more grass growing in my lawn. It's not my intention to solely grow dandelions. And so thinking about how much will it take for me to want to take aggressive action? And that does depend on the species of the plant that some of these, I was thinking like Canadian thistle. If there's one Canadian thistle in my pasture, I probably want to go kill it because it'll produce tens of thousands of seeds. And maybe in just a season, we'll go from there's just one, I'm not too worried about it, to we're taking over. And so need to understand something about the biology of the individual species that you're thinking about. And then finally, need to integrate together tactics, that there are a whole range of kinds of tools and tactics that you can use, from like physical disturbance of digging things up or chopping them off with a mower or a machete. We can do things in terms of rotating crops and smothering the soil, or timing our planting of various things that can help to control pests. There are biological control strategies. Sometimes we like bring in a herd of goats that can come and nibble all the green shoots off of some blackberries, or release some insects that will go and work on some weeds. And there are also chemical control strategies, both sort of organic herbicides and conventional herbicides that can be used. And depending on the weed, depending on the problem you're dealing with, some combination of these strategies tends to be what's required in order to provide really effective control. And we'll see some examples where if you just adopt a single tactic, it may work sort of in the short term, but you can end up with sort of accumulating challenges. If mowing is going to be your only strategy to control weeds, that'll work for a while, but sometimes plants can like change their shape and avoid your mower deck. If you're only going to use herbicides to control weeds, at some point some resistance to those chemicals will turn up and will no longer be effective. And so combining strategies can really be the best approach. And as we go through a set of weeds as we proceed, we'll talk about each of these strategies: the physical, the chemical, the cultural, and the biological. And so our first one is going to be puncture vine. Puncture vine, sometimes called caltrops, is a gnarly weed, really low growing, has these like tremendously spiky, injurious seed pods on it. Is one that I see growing in compacted areas, roadways, field edges, like farm lanes. And let's talk about some integrated strategies for controlling puncture vine. Ooh, I forgot. Let's see. I've got a bunch of resources that I put in a box folder, and if I can figure out how to get to my chat. Okay, so I just dropped a link in the chat box. If you click on that, it will bring you to a folder that's on the web, and it has lots of like 2 or 3 page guides on managing these weeds I'm going to talk about. It also has some longer guides and some other resources. I'll post this again at the end, but I just like bundled up some of the resources. Some I think are great, some I think are like, okay, but just wanted to share that with you. And I will share that later. Let me get my windows all back in place here. Put this there, and this here. So I think the best bet for controlling puncture vine is we got to be like really observant and on it. I tend to see it sort of start to show up in May, June, July. It's one of those things that like when I'm out like on other people's property, I like don't really let myself walk over puncture vine. I like got my pocket knife out and I'm going to pull that out of the ground because it has a really quick life cycle from like I can see this plant being there to having set ripe seed. And so if you say I'm going to come back in 5 days and work on the puncture vine, it's probably too late. And so hand pulling, just doing like the shallow cultivation with a hoe to cut it underneath its growing point or just underneath the where the root connects to the above ground part of the plant can be an effective strategy. So it grows in such like a mat close to the ground, you can't actually set a mower so close to the ground in order to control it. Does not survive well in places that have competition. It's not a species I would see in a pasture or a forage or anything like that. And so if there's some competitive vegetation there, don't expect to see puncture vine. That you can use landscape fabric or mulch or other things to try to prevent that plants from growing. And I've heard some examples, I've not tried this, but of people knowing that they've missed a few plants, that they know some have gone to seed and that there are spiky seeds that must be lying on the soil surface. Hear people like take a piece of old carpet and run that piece of old carpet over the ground, and you'll do the sort of like Velcro activity where these spiny seed pods will get entangled into that carpet. You can then like take that to the dump and get it off your property rather than letting those seeds propagate. Let's see. The puncture vine is yep, and I guess see in the chat box you can also use a vacuum. Yeah, I think you can also like use your bare hand, or I tend to like use my bare hand when I'm trying to pull it out of the ground and end up with kind of gnarly seeds in my hand. So careful. In terms of biological control, there isn't much of a grazing option. It is toxic to livestock, but there are a couple weevils that have been released. I think it's successfully established in California. And those can go and like drill into the stem or the seeds of that puncture vine and help reduce its population. They don't do a very good job of like overwintering in cold conditions, and can, depending on like the year, sometimes we'll have a better crop of those weevils than others. Let's see, and then chemical control strategies. Can spray the plants with Roundup or glyphosate, a sort of a broad spectrum type of herbicide. You need to do that before they set seeds. If there are ripe seeds on those plants, then you spray them with an herbicide. You'll have dead plants and ripe seeds, and that seems like a waste of herbicide in that regard, and not an effective use. 2,4-D is a broadleaf. A broadleaf weed killer can be used in a sort of grassy setting and will control the broadleaf weeds like puncture vine, leave the grasses alone. And then if you want something that's sort of like more durable in the soil, both of those are contact herbicides. You've got to have plants there in order for them to be affected. If you wanted something that has some residual in the soil, imazapyr and diaron are more durable options. And when we're using any kind of pesticide, and I'll repeat this later, we've got to read the label. And regardless of what I tell you, what the guy at the Grange Co-op or at Home Depot tells you about this works here, you're allowed to use this in this place, just spray it like this, you have to read the label. The label is the law on these things. Both protects you, the environment, the efficacy of these materials in order to use them. Let's see, there's a comment in the chat box that you can spray it with vinegar. That vinegar can be a really effective contact herbicide. And so again, this is when you see a green plant on the ground that has not shed any, does not have ripe seed on it, using something like vinegar can cause a similar effect on the plant that glyphosate would. Some folks are interested in like steaming weeds, that can work as well, and burning weeds if you're at a time of the year that you can do that safely. So I see some comments in here about vacuuming, and I'm going to let that get handled in the chat box. And so, Henry, burning works, but you have to burn it before it sets ripe seed. I saw a previous comment about does burning cause puncture vine to germinate? I don't know that to be the case. I don't think it has an obligate relationship with fire, but I'm not totally sure. We'd have to Google that. So on to our next troublesome weed. Poison hemlock is one that we see pretty often in field edges that grows after you've controlled your blackberry brambles, that see it pretty commonly in pastures. It is a poisonous species that we can identify it separately from something like Queen Anne's lace, which commonly grows in the same setting. Poison hemlock is like much taller, can be as tall as your head, and has purple flecks along the stem. And let's see. And so in terms of control strategies, it can be removed by hand, though it does have like an irritating poisonous compound in it. So you'd want to wear gloves while you're doing that. And you'd want to try to get down as much of that root as possible. As we mentioned earlier, poison hemlock is a biennial. And so if you just chop it off, it will continue to try to grow until it's completed that 2-year life cycle. You can mow it repeatedly, but it's really got to be a pretty repeated mowing in order to reduce down the energy reserves of that hemlock plant, to reduce its ability to set seed. A little bit later on, we'll talk more about how do we use this strategy of repeated mowing, in our favor to be effective. And then what else? And you can cultivate. If this is a system where you're gonna be in sort of a garden, or you want to do some transition from one vegetation type to another, that using cultivation or tillage is a way to control it. See, there's cultural practices. Most effective is grow something competitive. That, again, the time that I probably most frequently see poison hemlock is either along like the fence line where other vegetation has been removed, or in that place where we just went through and did like a major blackberry removal project. And now there's light and water and nutrients available that the blackberry is no longer using. And that's a good place for something else to grow. And in many cases, that's poison hemlock. Ideally, you get in ahead of that and say, what is my desired vegetation that I want to come and plant that before you start seeing weedy problems. It's not very effectively burnt and can create some toxins in the smoke when that happens. In terms of biological control, generally don't graze it. It's toxic to livestock. They'll tend to refuse to graze it. And that there's a little bit of information about a hemlock moth, that there's being some work currently done on that, and is not my sense with most of these insect biocontrol agents. I'm inclined to defer to folks at the Oregon Department of Agriculture, that they do a reasonable amount of research on both what will be effective in controlling economically important weeds, what will do that in a way that is going to not result in these moths going and like gobbling up a bunch of other desirable plants. And so if you're interested in doing that, kind of like thinking about releasing some kind of insect, I'd encourage you to get in touch with somebody at Extension or at ODA. We can point you to the right resources about, has this been tried? Should we expect it to be effective? And some other details. And then there's some chemical control strategies. Since this is a biennial, timing is important on making herbicide effective. That if you like wait till you see the big purple stem, you're probably too late to be very effective with an herbicide. You need to get it when it's at this low rosette stage, which is usually in the first year of its biennial life cycle. And in terms of sort of contact herbicides, glyphosate and triclopyr can be effective, and aminopyrrolid and metsulfuron are ones that have some residual in the soil, and so really can help to have sort of a longer term control of poison hemlock in many settings. Let's see. A good important one that we deal with is Himalayan Blackberry, and I think we're all reasonably familiar with the challenges that it causes. It really is a very good competitor, particularly in wet sites, and can like totally utilize the resources that are there. And so the challenge of Himalayan Blackberry is that it has these 3 different reproductive strategies, can reproduce both by the seeds that are produced in the fruit, can reproduce by rhizomes. And you can see these sort of like a rhizome is an underground stem. And you can see that some of these sort of horizontal structures have roots on them. So if you go through and chop up a patch of blackberry, that certainly will be something of a stress on those plants, but it will also divide up those plants and they can reroot from those cuttings. And then finally, there's you can have shoot tip rooting, sometimes called layering, where these big long canes will go and they'll lay down back on the ground and can reroot from that structure. And so we need to keep in mind that this guy's got a bunch of strategies to reproduce and can be difficult to control because of that. You can pull it out by hand or with various machinery, but you got to make sure that you get the roots out. I think I remember a story from Ron Hiller's that's working over at the Hanley farm of using a tractor to be able to take pretty tall plants in what is a relatively sandy soil and just be able to sort of like roll and push a big pile of blackberries up out of the soil. And that can work. You got to get the roots out or need to expect that it will that'll come back. And repeated cutting is a strategy that can be used. And I want to like take a few minutes now and talk you through a little bit of a schematic cartoon that I was working on earlier today to help think about what's going on within a plant when we mow it or cut it. Can we do that enough to kill a plant? If so, how? This topic of like defoliating plants is one that's of particular interest to me. That my training is in pastures and hayfields. And so those are systems that we want to be able to like cut the leaves off of plants and not kill the perennials because they're desirable forages. And some of those same phenomenon hold true for plants that we want to sort of like reduce their energy reserves and kill. And so let's walk through a growing season for blackberry and think about where the energy comes from and where it goes. And so generally like 2 types of energy occur within the plant. We've got the solar panel, so that's the leaves, the energy that comes from photosynthesis, or there is stored energy. And these are sugars that originally were created with photosynthesis and then are stored generally in the roots or the lower part of the stems of the plants, and in the case of blackberry. So if it's at this time of year, let's see, we've got a few leaves left on blackberry plants. These are last year's leaves. Many of them are dead or are dying. They are not photosynthesizing very effectively. We just got 1 dot out of our 5 on energy from the sun, very little. And the way that blackberries perenniate is through stored energy. This is in the roots, underground. It's the sugars or starches or other types of carbohydrates that will provide the energy when the plant wants to start regrowing in the spring. And so in the spring, the days get warmer, day lengths get longer, cues the plant to start growing. Plant needs energy to do that and doesn't have very many active leaves, and so is going to start to sprout some leaves, and that's going to be a drawdown of this stored energy. It's going to take energy out of its stored roots, and it's going to move it up into the plant to start to regrow new green leaves. At some point, these new green leaves are going to be large enough that they really will be meaningfully photosynthesizing. And when that occurs, come the summer, the plant will have relatively little in underground energy reserves and will have most of its energy from its leaves, the above ground material. Right as that transition occurs can be a reasonably sensitive time for a plant. If you went ahead and cut this right now, you'd remove all its solar panels, all of its capacity to generate new energy, and it'd be left with what is a relatively small reserve at that time of the year. Will not kill a plant doing that, but it's a relative weak point that if you were going in for battle, that might be a time to consider. As the fall approaches, then we see a downward movement of, I'm a perennial plant, need to prepare for winter. I've got these good leaves now, need to work on filling up that energy reserve, that store of sugars or carbohydrates in the root in order to perenniate through the winter. when you've got this sort of downward movement of energy in the fall, at about the time of the first frost, can really be one of the best times to control blackberry that needs to rebuild its reserves that are underground for the winter. If we go ahead and mow at that time or spray with an herbicide, can reduce the energy stored during winter. And now we've got a plant that's got no solar panel left and doesn't have a full battery and is headed into winter. It's going to be a relatively stressful time, and we'll have less of a chance of regrowing and being successful. That said, the next spring, chances are there still is something of an energy reserve in those roots. And if we let it, the plant will just keep growing. And so if we don't come back and like pay attention to this plant, then we can see regrowth just from its little bit of stored energy. And ideally at that point, we go ahead and when that regrowth appears, just as the plant is starting to get big enough leaves that it's going to have an effective solar panel again, we're going to say, nope, time to be mown. We're going to mow it again at that point, and we can increase over time as the plant uses a little bit of stored energy to try to make new leaves. If we can cut those off before those leaves become really meaningfully effective, that can start to be a strategy to use in order to control these kind of perennial plants that have these storage organs that we really need to affect in order to be able to control perennial weed like this. And if we like miss an opportunity to mow these, if we get a little bit lackadaisical and are going to go away for 6 weeks in the summer, this whole exercise of repeated mowing, they'll grow enough leaves to rebuild their energy reserve, and you really will be back to square one. And so the point I want to take away from this whole exercise is that for perennial plants, you can, with enough time, a little bit of knowledge of how the energy flow works up and down and is stored within the plant, and you're willing to come back and what ends up being like relatively frequently every week or so, come back and mow those plants off. It just is a question of how much energy is there. And when the plant is depleted or starved of energy, it'll die. May well take months or years, but possible. All right. So back to control methods. There are cultural control methods. We know that blackberry is flammable given fire conditions from this fall, but we should expect that it will regrow. But that could be one step or one tactic in a broader set of tactics that are used to control blackberry. We can plant competitive vegetation and particularly like trees and things that will shade out those environments. You need relatively thick canopy in order to reduce blackberry populations, but it definitely is one of the strategies to use. There are some biological control options. There is what has become a naturalized leaf rust in some parts of the Pacific Northwest that causes these sort of purplish spots on blackberry. That rust, which is a fungus, will reduce the capacity of blackberry to photosynthesize. So that means like that less effective solar panel and reducing the capacity of that to build up energy reserves. Can also use creatures like goats to browse off leaves. But browsing off leaves really is the same thing as a single mowing. It can be a piece of the puzzle. It probably won't be the whole thing. Let's see, I see things. Yeah, I'll see some things in the chat box. And yep, Henry, I hear you that mowing doesn't work. I'm telling you that mowing once doesn't work. I'm telling you mowing once a month doesn't work. I bet that if you were willing to, and you mowed every 2 weeks for 2 years, you'd have much less blackberry problem. But that's one of these things. We're always going to end up with trade-offs in what we can do, what we're willing to do, how big a problem we have. And so I hear you that like any one of these things alone may not work, but in a particularly targeted way, sometimes we can make these types of strategies work. Herbicides can be very effective. They tend to be applied We want to apply them in the fall as that plant is drawing energy from the above ground leaves and stems into its roots to prepare for winter. We'll also do an effective job of pulling that herbicide down into the plant. Two materials that come recommended, glyphosate or Roundup is very effective, as is triclopyr or Garlon. That we need to remember that in some cases we're applying these herbicides in the riparian zone is often when we see issues with a location where we see issues with blackberry, and really need to be both careful in doing that. And there are particular formulations both of glyphosate and of triclopyr that are designed to be acceptably safe. Again, not without trade-offs, but acceptably safe given the need to control riparian weeds like blackberry. But you need not to pick any formulation of Roundup, but one that very specifically says on the label that it is appropriate for use in aquatic sites. And so a really good guide that I'm put in that box folder is written by our own Max Bennett, the forester at SOREC. And this is probably too small to read clearly, but I would encourage you to look in that box folder or Google the document Managing Himalayan Blackberry. And Max's recommendation is that the most effective strategy is a combination of cutting and herbicide, where there's either cutting first and then herbicide on regrowth, or herbicide first and then cut down existing vegetation. And considerations include that, like, there will, even doing the best practice, there will be some resprouts that occur, and you're going to need to control those. If you say, well, I worked on this in the fall and now I'm going to give up on it for a year, you're going to have a huge big blackberry problem again. This is like, you got to play the long game for this to work. You can see some other strategies that are possibly or somewhat effective, but come with some caveats, including the like mowing it multiple times of the year over multiple years. It can work, it can be pretty expensive, tons of labor. And so we talk a little bit about herbicide here, and I want to tell you a case that I think some of you have heard, but just it is worth repeating, that we have a pesticide investigator who works for the Oregon Department of Agriculture and serves Southwest Oregon, is based down the hall at SOREC. He goes out and investigates cases of misuse, inappropriate use, movement of pesticides, tries to figure out what happened, and understand who's responsible, if there need to be changes to regulations to prevent those kind of things from happening in the future. So here's a case of a vineyard, and a vineyard that's in a little bit of a funny setting, like right within the urban growth boundary of Ashland. And this was, I think, the spring of 2018 when this occurred. Jeff got called out by the vineyard owner saying, something's wrong with my vines, I'm not sure what's going on. So Jeff went out and did his sort of standard reporting process. And so nice vineyard, right up against a bunch of neighbors. You can't quite tell from this picture, but there's something kind of funky going on with the brand new sprouts of those grapevines, the emerging leaves of that. Looking up closer, you can see like really twisted leaf structure and like flopped over and damaged leaves. This is pretty indicative of herbicide damage on grapevines, and we happen to know that grapes are particularly sensitive to a certain class of herbicides. He takes a few more pictures and sees some really poor looking grapevines here early in the spring in May, and a neighboring house that has like a surprisingly like a crunchy set of blackberries near it. Gets up closer, can see some dead and dying blackberries, like very dead and dying blackberries. Part of Jeff's work is to go like interview all the parties involved and try to understand what goes on there, and then does a little interview with the neighbor. This is what he got told by the neighbor, that he went to a local retailer and asked what he should use for blackberry, was told to use Crossbow. So Crossbow is an herbicide which is effective on blackberry. It's a combination of 2,4-D and triclopyr. This neighbor reported not reading the directions, took that gallon of triclopyr, poured it into a spray bottle, and went and used the entire gallon on that strip of blackberry along the fence line. He did not like see any of that material move onto the grapevines. And when Jeff told him about the volatile nature of the compounds within crossbow, his comment was, "I wish I knew that before I applied it." And the answer is he would have if he had just read the label. And so let's go look at the label for just a moment of crossbow. Oops. So here's a crossbow label. These things are like not the nicest to read. They're like folded up and glued onto the package, tend to be tiny, can be really long. But the label is the law and says it right here. It is a violation of federal law to use this product in a manner inconsistent with its labeling. Read all directions and use for use and carefully before you apply it. You've really got to do that because there are tons of tips in here to keep this kind of grapevine catastrophe from happening. And so let's read a few of those tips. First, it's about appropriate use sites. Where really are you allowed to use crossbow? And so it can be used for all kinds of unwanted brush and trees, for as well as annual and perennial broadleaf weeds, on rangelands, permanent pastures, conservation reserve program areas, fence lines, non-irrigation ditch banks, roadsides, non-crop areas, industrial sites. And so this label is a tiny bit vague because it says fence rows, and he was applying it directly on a fence. But what it does not say is that you can apply it in residential areas. They're really talking about agricultural fence rows and not like the picket fence that is between you and your neighbor. And so sometimes these things can be confusing, and you should call me. You should call the Department of Agriculture if you run into like a sticky corner of, I want to use this material. I can't quite tell if I've got the right use site. Help me like understand what this label means. We're game to help. We'd rather get questions beforehand than have problems afterwards. So if we had kept reading the label, we'd understand the potential for drift of this material. And it says avoiding spray drift at the application site is the responsibility of the applicator. Weather-related factors determine the potential for spray drift. The applicator is responsible for considering all of these factors when making spray decisions. 2,4-D esters, which are what are contained within crossbow, may volatilize during conditions of low humidity and high temperature, do not apply during conditions of low humidity and high temperature. And so I think this was applied at the end of April of 2018. And so reasonably dry conditions can be in the 70s and 80s at that time of year. And those are conditions that can cause this material in like a way that is not visible to our eyes. It has landed on the surface of that blackberry, can get picked back up off by the low humidity, high temperature conditions, and can move. And then we keep reading, and there's a warning about susceptible plants. And it says, do not apply under circumstances where spray drift might occur. Susceptible crops include, but are not limited to, cotton, okra, flowers, fruit trees, grapes, ornamentals, sunflowers, tomatoes. Small amounts of drift that may not be visible will injure susceptible broadleaf plants. And so says then there pretty clearly that spraying this near grapes would cause damage. Last piece that we didn't get the memo on was the like appropriate dilution. That the recommendation is to dilute down to a 1.5 or 4% spray mixture, not to use crossbow at a full rate. There was a significant amount of economic damage to that vineyard. I don't actually know the total outcome of this case, that it made it all the way up to the state legislature and the governor's office to discuss, should we adjust what the label says for crossbow? Do we need to prohibit this from being used on sort of home properties? And that the fellow was concerned that if his homeowner's insurance couldn't cover this misapplication of crossbow, that he could well have lost his house. Could be an extraordinarily expensive accident to make. And the answer is read the label. It's all contained in the label. These are not things to be scared of. It's like the medicine that sits in your medicine cabinet that you take 2 Advil when you have a headache, but you don't take 12 because you got to read the label, and that there are like risks and benefits to everything we do, and we can't, with many of these materials, can be really powerful agents, and we just need to make sure we use them safely in order to avoid the deleterious consequences. And I see some comments in here. I don't know if there are too many that I need to address. We can talk some more about that as we get to Q&A here shortly. Next weed that I would like to talk to us a little bit about is yellow star thistle. Yellow star thistle is another one of these like troublesome dry grassland weeds. And there really is an excellent guide that was put together by the University of California IPM crew that's called the Yellow Star Thistle Management Guide. It is like one of my favorite resources that I've come across, and I really like it because it really helps to understand the science of the management and what is the biology of this plant and how can we harness that biology. How can that biology be utilized in order to provide effective control? And it's like they show us good experiments and lots of data, and I'm a nerd for that kind of thing, and so I'll show you a little bit of it. Yellow star thistle is a troublesome invader in grasslands, and one of the reasons that it is troublesome is that it has very deep roots, can really effectively use water and grow in what are otherwise reasonably dry environments where other species will not grow as well, and can grow really quickly and go from being just a little sprout with a few inches of roots on it 20 days, 3 weeks after planting, and another month after that can have 2 meters worth of roots, can really hustle along and in such a way that can be really competitive against either the desirable annuals or perennials that you might have in a grassland system of that sort. And so that's sort of worth keeping in mind, and part of the reason that it's a troublesome thing. Yellow star thistle seeds are relatively short-lived. So here they did a trial back in the 90s in California, where at year 0, there were on the order of 4,000 or 4,200 viable seeds in the ground per square meter, and about 1,000 of those were able to germinate in the first year, or in that sort of year 0 when they were dropped on the ground. But by the 1 year later, had dramatically reduced both the number of viable seeds and germinating seeds, and by year 2, reduced further still, and year 3 really pretty close to 0. And it doesn't mean that there will be no viable seeds that are able to germinate, but you've dramatically reduced it. And so you might be able to set yourself up a 3 or 4 year plan of, I'm not going to let any yellow star thistle plants on my property produce seeds. I'm going to figure out whatever it takes to do that. And if I can keep that up for a handful of years, can really dramatically reduce the potential for yellow star thistle to occur. You could basically eradicate it off of your property. Strategies for doing that include a range of mechanical control strategies. You can hand pull it. You've got to get it like below the branches in order for that individual plant to die. It is like spiny and kind of mean, but we know like a number of folks in the Land Steward program that over the course of a handful of years have just made a point of it being their activity on their afternoon walk. Well, I'm going to go and work through the property and pull yellow star thistle. If I can do that over the course of 2 or 3 years, I'll deplete down the seed bank. And so long as we don't allow new plants, we do all those good prevention practices, may well eradicate yellow star thistle from the property or turn it into a really minor pest rather than a major one. It can be mown, but needs to be mown below the branches. We'll talk about strategy for that. It can also be killed through tillage, though often doesn't grow in sites. These are like our dry hillsides that are not sort of conducive to tillage. So strategy on mowing has important sort of piece of timing where yellow star thistle, as it matures, first sets out its spines, then has sort of yellow blooming flowers. Then those flowers start to senesce, dry up, turn brown. And it's at that point that the seed becomes viable. And so if you mow right when you first see yellow star thistle, when it's in this spiny pre-bloom kind of phase, yellow star thistle is what I might anthropomorphize as a smart plant, but in sort of more ecologically appropriate terms is a plastic plant, where if you mow it early in its life cycle, its annual life cycle, it will just set new flowers, but it'll set those new flowers closer to the ground. That's what plastic means in plant world. It can change its shape in response to a stimulus. And so need to wait till we see about 5% yellow flowers blooming, and then you mow it to the ground, and that will kill most of that yellow star thistle before it has ripe, viable seeds. If you wait longer, you'll mow it, you'll chop up those plants, but you'll throw seeds everywhere. And so a little bit more on that. Again, low mowing results in the pincushion effect of, yes, you've mowed it, you've taken off some of that floral tissue, the plant has the capacity to set new flowers, and they're just closer to the ground such that you really can't mow it. And mowing height is particularly important. That works successfully when you can mow to the ground, but when you mow at 2 or 3 inches that we'd normally set a mower deck to, many of those seed heads and flowers will survive and produce new seeds. And so certainly is hard on the mower, and particularly in like rocky, hilly, not very even sites to try to be mowing at ground level, but it can work to reduce a population, but has a trade-off. Again, like many of these practices have a trade-off of probably going to need to spend some time sharpening the blades of the rotary mower if we're going to set it that close to the ground. And this speaks to that same point here, 3 sites in California, where they worked on either had an existing population of grass that grew along with the star thistle, or planted grasses along with the star thistle. Having a little bit of grass around the star thistle caused that star thistle to sort of reach upwards, so it wouldn't get outcompeted or shaded out by the neighboring grasses. When it does that, the location of those branches move upwards as well. And so in the right-hand bar of each of these 3 examples is with grass, there's grass near it, and you can see that it branches up at 30 centimeters, and that's like 10 inches? It's pretty tall, where 10 centimeters is about 4 inches. And so when it's got that companion plant, that grass nearby, you can then set your mower to 2 or 3 or 4 inches rather than at 0 inches. Mow the yellow star thistle, cut it below the branches. It will no longer grow, and you haven't like damaged your mower by running it over a bunch of rocks. You can burn yellow star thistle at the early stage of flower, but again, we've got like risks and opportunities with each of these tactics. By the time we're in the early flower stage, we're often out of a period, at least in the Rogue Valley, that it's safe and reasonable to burn. You can plant cover crops. And I really think that this is a good part of a strategy for controlling yellow star thistle, particularly on sort of larger areas that you've got intentions of sort of like changing over a plant community on. That yellow star thistle is really averse to shade. And so here's an example of like above ground biomass of the yellow star thistle, and then the percentage of full sunlight. We're over here, we're at 100%, just like normal full sun, we're growing 40 grams of biomass. If you can provide like 25% shade, take it down to 75% full light, you go to about like 10 or 12 grams of yellow star thistle, cut it in more than half. So just like a little bit of shade will dramatically reduce the capacity for that yellow star thistle to grow. When I'm like wandering around these kind of like oak savanna, open annual grassland sites, I know that when I step underneath the oak tree, the yellow star thistle is gone. When I step into the full sun, there's a great patch of yellow star thistle. That is this phenomenon that we're seeing. And same holds true for the roots. And so oak trees can be part of the paradigm of controlling yellow star thistle, though probably not easy to do in a short period of time. But quick growing cover crops, things like some of the cereal grains like barley, triticale cereal rye are very fast growing and so would grow up faster than the yellow star thistle, provide some shade, and then suppress down that star thistle, making it less efficient at reseeding itself. Also, some legumes, something like crimson clover, come to mind as being quick growing and can effectively help to shade down and reduce the biomass of yellow star thistle. And so we can use some combination of mowing, of planting cover crops and inducing shade, of hand pulling. Can be grazed in terms of a biological control strategy, but causes toxicity in horses. That's not true for sheep or cattle. And there are several insects that can attack seeds, but again, there's sort of some fluctuating populations and hard to keep a good healthy population of the seed attacking insects alive, sort of in order to really get enough control to feel like that could be a major part of a strategy. And then there are chemical control options too that are particularly effective on sort of efficacy trials are called clopyralid and aminopyralid. Those are applied when the yellow star thistle is at its rosette stage. You might not even like recognize this as yellow star thistle, but that's when the herbicides are really going to be effective. They can both kill those rosettes and keep a next set of seeds from germinating. We often get the phone call of like, well, I've got a field full of yellow flowers. It's like, well, you're too late for this year. If you've got a field full of yellow flowers, that means they've got ripe seeds and you're going to have to play again next year in order to be really effective. Go ahead and mow it if you want, but you're just going to drop those seeds on the ground. And here's just an efficacy trial here on the left-hand side, got no herbicide treatment. On the right-hand side, got the clopyralid treatment, and can really do a very good job of controlling yellow star thistle. Let's see, I see a comment in here. So mow at full bloom or before. We want to mow at 5% bloom. When you see the very first yellow flowers open, we need to mow to the ground if we want mowing to be effective. If we've gotten all the way to full bloom, some of those seeds will be ripe and we just spread them across the farm. So got to catch it right in the middle. Too early, they turn into a low pin cushion. Too late, they've got ripe seeds. 5% yellow flowers. That's our threshold for mowing. And like all of these things we've been talking about, it's an integration of strategies that appear to be most effective. I would again encourage you to check out this yellow star thistle management guide. It describes both these sort of kind of scientific experiments and has some of these rules of thumb. I've taken most of this part about yellow star thistle right out of that guide. And then has a number of case studies of things that have worked. A combination of using one pass of herbicide and then revegetating with wheatgrass, doing a couple seasons of prescribed burning followed by one pass of herbicide, using some of those biocontrol insects in combination with herbicide, or grazing and then strategic mowing and revegetation with subterranean clover is a strategy they describe in there. Trying to think if there's something else I wanted to say. Oh, and this yellow star thistle guide is in that box folder, and I will actually just this second give you the link to that one more time so you can check it out and go find that guide. It's a free PDF where you can buy yourself a copy of the book. I think this is the last weed. We'll see if that I want to talk about buttercup or ranunculus. There are a number of species of this that grow in Southern Oregon pastures. This I really think of as being like a pasture weed, and it's an irrigated pasture weed, but shows up and is successful for a number of reasons in our pastures here and elsewhere in the world. It can be hand removed in small patches, but mowing really does not help very well. It can grow pretty close to the ground, and there isn't like a secret trick of when to mow it to be really effective in controlling it. That there are cultural methods for controlling it, and this really is the case for many weeds in an irrigated pasture is that the grasses and legumes, the forage species you have in a pasture, really are very competitive. They're there in your pasture because they are successful in surviving being grazed or being mown for hay, so long as we treat them nicely. You can beat up forage plants and they will not grow well. And when that is the case, then weeds start to take over and fill that niche. And so we need to practice careful grazing management or hay harvest management, work to operate sort of appropriate soil fertility, managing the pH and using soil tests to understand where you are. Both too much fertilizer and too little can cause stress to the desirable plants, which again open up a niche for the weedy ones. And buttercup is one that grows in like sort of pastures that are kind of too wet. And so got to be careful about irrigation management. I know many people are flood irrigating, and that just does not allow for very careful management of irrigation. We also have soils that, in some parts of the valley that are really sticky clay, and when they are wet, they tend to stay wet. But that's an environment that is conducive to buttercups proliferation. So biological control strategies, there aren't any of these like insect beasts that work on buttercup like there are on several others of these. Why is buttercup bad? I think that's a good question, Henry. It's not a forage. It contains a compound that's like sits somewhere on the continuum from being like irritating to animals to being toxic to them. It's called ranunculin. And some species of buttercup are more toxic than others. And if I'm irrigating a piece of ground and fertilizing it and intending to have that supply forage for livestock, having a lot of buttercup will take the place of those desirable forages and just reduces the like amount of forage that you can grow. Are any of these plants like inherently bad? I think we could have like a good philosophical discussion of, are plants bad or not? I guess we call this like managing troublesome weeds, and it's sort of on you to make a decision of, is this a troublesome weed for me? There's certainly ones that we know are sort of noxious or are designated as such and at a state or local level and really have a tendency to like get out of control, and probably easier to make an argument about those being bad species. But what does bad mean? I don't know. I don't expect that this is going to kill your livestock. It may cause some like dermatitis or some like rash or sunburn issue. That is not a good thing, but I don't know that makes buttercup a bad plant. And then there are some chemical control strategies. People often end up using some if they've gotten themselves stuck into a corner of pasture management where a little bit of overgrazing, a little mismanagement of fertilizer, lime and irrigation water, and you don't want to like tear up that pasture, don't want to plow it in and replant. We'll end up using a broadleaf herbicide. And again, we need to get this before we've got a field full of yellow flowers. That's going to be like a good refrain on effective herbicide, at least for this suite of weeds that we're talking about this evening, is that once you see all those yellow flowers and like remember that like, oh yeah, I've always had problems with buttercup and it's just like that time of year again, we're still sort of too late. We've got to like put a note in the calendar to come back in March and spray our herbicide. These are two broadleaf herbicides that are called phenoxy herbicides. MCPA is a particularly effective one on buttercup and is good about killing buttercup and not some of the other like desirable legumes, the clovers and trefoil that might appear in a pasture. 2,4-D will kill sort of broadly the broadleaf weeds. But again, timing is important, and trying to catch those early in the spring before the flowers open is important for efficacy of control. And then just maybe 2 more slides, and then we'll dive into what other kind of questions we have. When we're using herbicide, we want to make sure that we're thinking carefully about how we apply it. there's certainly like some situations when you like might want to fly a plane or a helicopter over a big extensive rangeland and apply herbicide in that way. And so long as that is done carefully and over a target environment that really is adequately infested with that weed, may well be the best strategy. But I think for small landowners, people who are working on stewarding a property, I certainly think that herbicide should be a tool that we consider in the toolbox. It is not one that we should always use. It is not one that you have to use, but I think it's one that's worth considering because there are downsides to many of these practices. We can mow things to a deleterious state. We can cause wildfires. We can use tillage to control plants and cause major erosion issues that both degrades the soil on our property and is a pollutant into surface water. And so herbicides like that have both benefits and have risks associated with them. If we can use tactics to really carefully like place herbicide in particular places, that can be helpful to limiting any of those sort of like non-target unintended consequences. For woody or brushy kind of things, including blackberry, that immediately after it's cut can come back with a paintbrush or some other, if used, well, what are those things called? The like, you want to do like instant shoe shine. You get a little, like a bottle that has shoe shine in it and has a little sponge at the top. Once you like finish polishing up your boots, clean that out, can put herbicide right in there and use that to dab onto cut stems of trees, brushy things. Here's an image of an herbicide injector. And so here's one of our purple spotted poison hemlocks, and can inject a small amount of herbicide directly into the stem of that plant so it doesn't come into contact with any other desirable vegetation nearby. Just sort of a note of caution with both of these strategies, you often use really pretty concentrated herbicide to do that, and sometimes end up applying a higher quantity of herbicide per acre in like a tiny little bit of an injection into lots of stems than you would doing a broadcast spray. And so again, nothing is perfect. There are trade-offs, but using these stem injectors is an option. A tool that I'm increasingly interested in is called a weed wiper. And it's like a sponge that is impregnated with that herbicide. You can wipe it across the species you want to affect and not have that herbicide touch any of the other species that you're concerned about. We can use backpack sprayers to do targeted spraying. Let's see, like another iteration of this weed wiper tool is a tractor or a ATV mounted one. So here's like the same sponge. This is impregnated with an herbicide like Roundup or glyphosate that'll kill most things it touches. And then we get weeds like this, probably a Canadian thistle, or certainly a thistle of some sort. You can see that that's growing much taller than the surrounding forage grass. So if you drive over this thistle, you'll wipe the thistle with herbicide, but you'll not touch any of the grass. And so it's a good way of selectively removing out certain weeds, particularly ones that are taller than your desirable crop. And I think with that, I am at the end. This is a set of 6 resources that I like pretty well that include this yellow star thistle management guide. As you look up in that box folder, you'll find, and I think Rachel posted a couple on other thistles. This book, which is called Weed Control in Natural Areas in the Western United States, really is quite good, talks about the whole gamut of strategies, sort of in the way that I have, from cultural to physical to biological and chemical controls. It's not just a list of herbicides you can apply, but is a whole set of tactics. And again, we've got a number of resources up in this box folder. I will post it just one more time in the chat box so you can find that. And I trust Rachel maybe will send us out with the recording, and so you can go back and look up those resources. And with that, I am gonna stop sharing my screen, and let's see what we can, whoops. I've got a couple other weeds in there, but let's just do some Q&A. Thoughts on controlling poison oak? I'd have to look up what the best cultural control practices are for poison oak. It's one of these like brushy perennial species that if you were like game to like wear your body suit so you didn't get poison oak sort of splattered all over you, if you're going to go do a bunch of mowing, that probably with strategic timing and repeated mowing, you could knock that down aggressively. Herbicide like triclopyr is good on most brushy kind of species, including poison oak. You could spray it on the leaves. That would be one strategy, but would also affect some of the other broadleaf plants that are around that in an open environment. You could carefully like use your loppers depending on how large an area you have of poison oak. I think if I had a moderately small area of poison oak, my strategy would probably be use the loppers to cut off those stems and then come back with triclopyr and dot a little paintbrush worth of herbicide right on that cut stem, not on anything else, and probably will kill poison oak pretty effectively in that way. Yeah, a whole meadow's worth of Medusa head. That's a good troublesome question. And Medusa head is one that I end up asking a question, and maybe I should have stressed this more clearly. Like, what really is your desired state? We spend basically the whole evening talking about how to control or kill weeds, and if that's our only step in the plan is to kill the weeds, we need to expect that something will grow back in that place. And it may be more of the same weed. It may be some other troublesome weed. And Medusa head is one that is an annual grass. Those seeds will only last in the soil for 1 or maybe 2 years, but most of them will sprout in the first year. If you time it right, and that is really like sort of a nuanced timing exercise, you can mow it to the ground and reduce the amount of seed that it sets. It can be grazed really tightly by animals, and they're going to have to be sort of hungry and aggressive animals, and probably not your like one pet horse. And if you can reduce down that weed seed bank and then get some other like a sort of aggressive annual grasses to grow, I think about annual ryegrass, think about oats. There are some other like annual rangeland species like soft chess that's sold as Blando brome can be really kind of competitive in those systems. So what's coming to me off the top of my head. In that box folder, I did post a Medusa head management guide, and it's got a whole range of recommendations from herbicide to mowing to animal livestock control. What is the best time to use herbicide for star-thistle florets? We want to get that in the winter. Timing matters only in that they're in that rosette stage. I assume you mean rosette rather than floret. Floret has a flower in it. Rosette is this like low structure that sits on the ground. Can be done this time of the year all the way through early spring. But once you start to see the like reproductive cycle of that plant sort of pushing up a seed head and setting flowers, then you're probably too late for that season. Yeah, I'm not familiar with Italian arum in order to comment on that, but maybe we can hold it and if we've got some time here at the end. But I see questions popping up faster than I'm getting to them. I see a comment here about poison oak is a native plant. It feeds wildlife. Leave it be if you can. And I say, like, fair game. What makes a weed troublesome? What makes a weed bad? Certainly, like growing in a place that it's going to like wipe across your shoulder every time you go for a walk in the afternoon, that may trip it into a category of being a troublesome weed. Is it definitionally trouble? Like, no, is plenty of these plants have benefits. Sometimes like the really nice patch of yellow star thistle that is dominating that rangeland is the only pollinator resource that is out there. It's an invasive introduced plant, but can be really good, nectar source for pollinators. Does that mean it's good or bad? Depends on your goals. Let's see. So, Rachel, I may need your help managing questions. These are happening faster than I can scroll through and keep track of.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so there's some
thank you
chat in there. I wanted to mention some folks were talking about wanting organic methods, and I mentioned that this class that's coming up in March, on March 22nd, is exactly what some folks were talking about, weed control using tarping and solarization.
Yep.
There was a question way at the beginning about curly dock. And
cool. I don't know if I can do that one off the top of my head.
Well, I put in the chat the UC Davis website, which is where a lot of the information from the weed management guide comes, and that's a really great site. You can look up any of these species. The Italian arum, I'm familiar with that plant, but that one is a bugger to get rid of as well. So the UC Davis site has lots of these lists that have both the cultural controls, so what you want to do if you don't want to use herbicides, what are the best tactics to use, and then also kind of how to, in the safest manner, use herbicides. So it's certainly, you know, a choice that people make, and there are drawbacks to all those things. I mean, as we've seen, you know, like in the fire with the Almeida fire, that the blackberry being overrunning things, that certainly has a hazard, and it really reduces the riparian habitat. So like an overabundance of native or of invasive weeds can also be a problem in itself. So it's really a matter of trying to pick, you know, do the least harm first and what you can actually do. Most of these things, I was going to offer too that in our land steward group, there are a lot of land stewards who have eradicated star thistle just by hand, by picking, but they're out there picking like 2,000 star thistles every night. So, you know, for years, which is admirable and wonderful. And if you have that in you, more power to you. So it's really a matter of balancing kind of your values and your energy and in kind of all kinds of ways. So other questions that I saw that weren't answered. I think you got to a lot of them. The Medusa head was one of them.
Right, and then I saw some comments before about 2,4-D and herbicides, and I certainly am not like a person who would say that herbicide should be the first choice. I guess for me that when I think it's easy to do nothing. If you don't think you have a real problem, just don't do anything. And like things will happen, that succession will occur. It will be slower than our lifetimes in some cases of the like mountain of blackberry. You don't have to do anything in the case of most of these weeds. But you may want to. And for me, I start with the whole toolbox. And I say, there are lots of different kinds of tools. I know some will be more effective, some will be less effective. I know some come with like real risks. In some cases, we can use wildfire effectively to really check populations of weeds, but it comes with a real risk. Like I'm not gonna, in the same way, I don't wanna be the person who ends up spilling herbicide into the stream or killing my neighbor's grapes because I've strayed out from best management. I am also the person who does not want to cause the next wildfire. I also don't want to like plow up a hillside and cause all that soil to erode into the stream. And it ends up being sort of a nuanced argument of there's a chance I'm going to cause a wildfire, there's a chance I'm going to cause major erosion, and that there's a chance that we've got off-target unintended consequences to me as an individual, to the soil microbiome, to neighboring plants from using herbicide. Like, I'm a game to have those conversations, but I think we'll find they're kind of nuanced and kind of hard to say, well, you obviously should always do this and you should never do that. And it's sort of site specific, sort of case specific, and you're allowed and encouraged to like have your own philosophy about how you move forward. My intention this evening was to give you lots of options, not to say just do this. And I hope that came across, that we, in every case, that chemical control is just one set of strategies that come with 4 or 5 or other 6 other options. And so I hear you that, and if I guess one other plug on herbicides, that one of the other projects that I work on is our local pesticide stewardship partnership, that we monitor tributaries of Bear Creek, both in agricultural, forestry, and urban kind of settings. And we look for on the order of like 140 pesticides and are out there 15 or 20 times a year, dipping out water and trying to feed back information. And I can tell you that some of these things that I've just said are effective, that triclopyr, the 2,4-D, the glyphosate, those are all materials that we find in the water. We don't find them very often. I rarely find them at concentrations that are high enough that we really are like alarmed that we're like certain we're killing something in the water, but they're there. There are other materials that we're more worried about. We sometimes find insecticides, and do occasionally find herbicides at high enough concentrations that we really can expect that they're degrading the aquatic system. But we like work hard on understanding where are those coming from and how can we apply good outreach and education to make sure that alternatives are being used, that the best application management strategies are being used, that appropriate integrated pest management techniques are being used. And I've had some successes on seeing things in certain streams, reaching out to landowners and seeing those entirely disappear through education. We're gonna have an event on March 11th, which I probably will pass to Rachel, because I don't think I have that on the website yet, or even any further details than to tell you that it's on March 11th in the evening. But I will get those details sorted out, and we're gonna review our last year's worth of findings of water quality sampling during 2020 and have both some like positive successes and some like, oh, we've got new problems to work on that you may all be interested in.
That's great. Good. Well, and I think, you know, one of the things that Gordon was talking about too, and this is really key to integrated pest management, is really understanding the species that you're dealing with. And also part of that is understanding kind of the context that you're in as well, knowing what, you know, what constitutes a healthy system, whether it's a pasture that has beneficial forages or a native environment. And Tula made a comment about poison oak. And I know I always advise landowners to just, if it's in your way where, you know, you walk, then that's where you can take care of it, because a lot of native plants have beneficial, the juncus that was in the beginning picture, the rushes, you know, those are native plants as well. So like really starting from informing yourself about what these species are, understanding their life cycle, where's the place with the least harm, you can interrupt that if it's a problem species for you. I think, so I really appreciate it, Gordon. I think you did a good job of showing a lot of variety. And I know some people are really against chemical control. It is about weighing all those costs of what you're dealing with, I think. So we are, I don't know if there's one final question. Looks like 7:29, 7:30 is our.
Yeah. There's a question about managing teasel.
Oh yeah.
Teasel is like an annual, sometimes a biennial, reproduces from seed. Usually starts in like relatively discrete patches and then can like increasingly like move on. Don't let it go to seed. Go out there and like lop those things off and get them into a trash bag so you don't shed seed on the way back to the barn to the compost pile. Don't let them go to seed. Give it a few years. Seeds aren't super long lived in the soil. Is an easy like chemical-free strategy if you're like willing to go do some walking and some lopping and some mowing. There are herbicides that you can use. Again, it's sort of this has a rosette stage and then turns into a more upright reproductive phase. Herbicides will be effective only at that rosette stage and not when it's already has its big, what do you call those, combs or something out and about.
Question about burning star thistle. 20 acres of star thistle. Could burning work on that?
So
seed bank?
Probably in a like 20-acre kind of site, I don't expect that you burn hot enough to affect the seed bank, but what would affect the standing crop. I think what I was reading in the management guide, and you should refer to that as well. There's a good section on burning. That's going to be my refrain for the evening. Is there are lots of resources that know better than I do. That like, so long as you continue to burn, if you burn every year, you will suppress your population of yellow star thistle, and it will encourage natives. When you stop burning the yellow star thistle and you do nothing else, yellow star thistle comes back, the natives are suppressed, you get yellow star thistle again. And so needs to be burning in combination with revegetation, burning in combination with strategic mowing, with herbicide application and revegetation can be a strategy. But on its own is really a temporary kind of deal. And let's see, I had a private chat here about what the half-life is of the herbicide that you could dot on poison oak. And so that's triclopyr is that herbicide in the soil half-life is about 30 days, I think. In water with light is about 1 day, and in dark environments, it doesn't break down very well and lasts for hundreds of days. But for all of these things, there are too many weeds in the world and too many herbicides. I'd like really encourage you to reach out to experts that I can tell you I spend lots of time like understanding how do we like look at Google and have it help us give us the answers that I guess my like last little tidbit on how do we find good answers on weeds from Google. I like type in control this weed, and usually you'll see sites that are from the federal government, like the USDA and the Forest Service will have things. I find that those tend to be pretty just descriptive, but don't give me tips on management. We get lots of hits back from soil and water conservation districts, particularly just they'll often have pages, and those can be really helpful and written in easy language. But I also know that soil and water conservation districts don't have like weed researchers who are out doing the like controlled experiment to figure out this actually worked better than that did. And so I tend, and maybe I must be biased because I work for a university that does this kind of stuff. I really think that the universities do a good job because they've got scientists to try it. And that's what I like about most of these resources I pointed to you, is that it's not anecdotal. It's not like passed down from generation to generation. It's that we've tried this and we've tried it here or just across the border in California. And we found that these things worked and this was why. And so I tend to head towards those university sites that have some evidence that they've like done some trialing when I really want to drill into this information. And I really am happy that there are questions we've not addressed here. I hope Rachel will provide my email address, and I'm happy to help folks think through finding good resources, weighing the options and the pros and cons of different strategies, and I'm game to help. But I think that's all I have. I'm appreciative of all you joining this evening and lots of good questions and discussion in the chat box, and hopefully gain something a little bit useful or can find something in some resources that'll help you move forward with your good stewardship that you're working on.
All right, thanks so much, Gordon. I really appreciate it. We all appreciate your time. I'm going to launch this poll really quickly. It's just 3 simple questions. And as mentioned at the beginning, or I might not have mentioned it, I know it was in the notes. I'm recording this and I'll be sending you a link to this recording. We'll include the link that Gordon provided for us, as well as his contact information. You'll get that sometime tomorrow, not like first thing in the morning, but sometime tomorrow. And again, if you are interested in the tarping and solarization method, that's very intensive, and that's what we're going to have a class coming up on that with Scott Good. And check out our website for upcoming things, and just the SOREC website in general. There are lots of good things that are coming out from lots of different programs. So thank you so much for joining us. And Gordon, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. You're welcome.
And I'm just going to leave the poll up for a minute here and then capture that in a screenshot.
the poll results do go into your Zoom account somewhere. They're a little bit hard
Oh,
to get out.
they
They
do.
do.
It's true theoretically, but I have not been able to download without registration. I haven't been able to download a poll report. I went through a whole tech thing with them. Have you?
Well, I may have lied. It is possible, but it's been like 6 months since I've tried to do it, and they
Okay.
changed Zoom enough that it was one of those weird things. They did not make it easy. They're like two different kinds of reports or something, and you have to click on the one and then the other.
Yeah, I talked with tech for a long time about it. There's a register. We couldn't figure it out. Maybe they fixed it, but I'm just going to screenshot it.
Good. That seems like a wiser strategy. Fair enough.
There's
Scott,
Mr.
good to see you.
Good.
Have a good evening. Thanks for coming. All right.
So, yeah. Thanks
Dinner
so
time
much.
for me. Cool.
Okay, thanks for giving us an evening, Gordon.
My
Take
pleasure.
care.
Yep. See you
Talk to
soon.
you soon.
Bye.
Yep. Bye-bye. Mm-hmm.